Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another glorious day at sea, and Merry Christmas. I'd like to welcome you to this presentation. We're going to talk about three of our destinations in the Caribbean today, so it's going to be kind of a snapshot, if you will, of each of the three. I kind of covered the early history of all the islands and the geology sort of stuff yesterday. And last time, as you remember, we talked about the Arawak and the Carib and the Chiboney people. And then the French, of course, brought in African workers to the area. And the English also tried to gain control of the island. So all during the history of these islands, more or less modern history, there's always been some kind of a controversy. We're going to do a historical tour, if you will, or a hysterical maybe, I don't know, historical tour of Guadeloupe Grenada. I call it Grenada. Some people call it Grenada. You can use your choice. I'll pick Grenada because that's what I'm most used to, and a Curacao. Pointe-à-Pitre is a big town, a really pretty good sized town, and that'll be our port of call in Guadeloupe. Oh, by the way, again, happy holidays, Merry Christmas, all that sort of stuff. It's going to be a great day, but Susie always has to ask me the same question every year. And I suppose you're going to be working again this Christmas. This is Christmas number 8. Anyway, that's the story of my life. Guadeloupe is located in the Leeward Islands, and as you know, Leeward Island is usually very dry due to the lack of rain. Guadeloupe is also part of the Lesser Antilles in the Caribbean. And the Lesser Antilles are a group of islands that were first colonized by the Dutch. Guadeloupe's two main islands, Basse-Terre and Grande-Terre, are separated by a very narrow strait, and it's crossed by a bunch of bridges. As a result, a lot of people just kind of refer to the two islands as one. So they just say, oh, it's Guadeloupe. They don't even think about the fact that there's two islands. The Arawak arrived on Guadeloupe about 1,700 years ago, and they called the island Beautiful Waters, and they are, in fact, beautiful. 500 years later, a new group of Amerindians, the Carib that I talked about yesterday, annihilated those early Arawak. The Carib also came from South America, and they remained in pretty much isolation on the island for nearly 6 centuries. Our good friend Christopher Columbus was the first European to land on Guadeloupe, and that was during his second voyage to the New World back in 1493. His fleet landed here in search of fresh water, and he left no colonists. He just kind of stopped, looked around, got some water, and said goodbye. So he did take one thing from this island with him when he returned to Spain. That was a pineapple. So Columbus, if you will, is credited, at least by some people, with the European discovery of pineapple. He called it the Piña des India, or the pine cone of the Indies. The fruit actually originated in South America and had been brought to Guadeloupe by the early Arawak. Columbus named the island Santa Maria de Guadalupe de Extremadura. I like Guadeloupe just myself. And that's because it was after an image of the Virgin Mary that was worshipped in a monastery back in Guadeloupe in Spain. In the 17th century, Spanish settlers attempted to establish a colony on the island, but the Carib natives attacked and drove them away. In the meantime, the French successfully developed a settlement over on St. Kitts, which isn't too far away. And those people decided to colonize Guadeloupe. I guess St. Kitts got a little too crowded for the 50 or 60 of them that were there. They took possession of Guadeloupe in 1635, and they actually wiped out many of the Carib natives. Within 40 years, the people from St. Kitts had annexed the island to the Kingdom of France. And over the next 100 years or so, the island was seized several times by Great Britain, and then it was lost back to France and went back and forth between the two. Why did they fight over it all the time? Well, the conflict was basically over sugar. Guadeloupe produced more sugar than all of the British islands in the Caribbean combined. The production at the time was worth quite a bit of money, and in today's value, it'd be somewhere around 6 million pounds a year, maybe a little bit more. Fort Fleur de Epée was the scene of numerous battles during the 7-Year Wars between the French and the English. That's a good place if you want to see things from the mid-18th century, and there's battlements and magazines and underground rooms. And while you're visiting the fort, you want to check out the dungeons. You know, it's always one of the favorite places to go. Kind of reminds me that being in a doghouse when Susie's angry with me isn't really that bad. The Treaty of Paris, of course, ended the 7 Years' War. Now, the British had to make a decision. Guadeloupe or Canada? Guadeloupe or Canada? Well, they kept Canada and gave Guadeloupe back to France. After the outbreak of the French Revolution, Guadeloupean, I love that term, Guadeloupean, monarchists refused to honor the laws that came out from France for equal rights for free people of color. So those monarchists, those were people that wanted to revert back to the monarchy in France, declared independence from France in the early 1790s. Then they refused to receive a new governor that Paris had assigned later in the year. Well, that didn't really fly too well with the people in France, but nonetheless, 2 years later, there was a slave rebellion on Guadeloupe. The island's upper classes, instead of turning to France for help, they turned to Britain for help. Now, the British seized Guadeloupe and held a control over it for a couple of years. Ultimately, though, it was returned back to France and the slaves were freed. But that resulted in attacks on the former slave owners who controlled all of the sugar plantations. Then along came our good friend Napoleon Bonaparte. He restored the practice of slavery in all but 3 of the French colonies. Napoleon sent an armed force to recapture Guadeloupe from the rebellious slaves. Now, his force came here and they killed about 10,000 of the local people. Pretty soon it became obvious that the French troops would take control of the island, and a group of the revolutionary soldiers' leaders killed themselves on the slopes of the volcano rather than be taken prisoner by the French army. In 1810, the British seized Guadeloupe again, and they occupied it until 1816. And that's when the Treaty of Vienna recognized French control for the island. After 77 years, French citizenship and the right to vote were finally granted to Guadeloupe's Native Indians, and slavery was finally abolished across the island. Present-day economy of Guadeloupe depends on tourism, agriculture, some light industry, and services. Over 80% of the island's tourists come from France, and it is a very strong French-speaking country. The island depends on France for very large economic subsidies as well as imported food. As we said earlier, Guadeloupe is home to a cultural mix of African and French settlers. One of many characteristics that developed from the Creole is a local style of dress. The basic dress was probably church-inspired or maybe inspired by things that happened in their society. Emancipated slave women on the island usually wore clothing that was handed down from the plantation owners' wives. The costumes included a dressing gown, which was known by several names, including the cozy one, I kind of like that, the cozy dressing gown, or the main dress. Their outfits also often included lace or embroidery, and later they had a kerchief that was called a mouchoir that was added along with petticoats. Now the mouchoir is knotted and decorated with jewelry. That's a scarf that they wear. And the necklaces and bracelets each had their own name. So these women, when they would put on a piece of jewelry, they would put on a thing sometimes named after a plant, something like a cabbage necklace or a pineapple bracelet. They also had some other unusual names like thick syrup. I just can't picture what a bracelet called thick syrup would look like. Or colonial helmet for a hat. Now that's kind of an interesting name. Probably wasn't all that comfortable. Something the islanders learned early on was that hats were very necessary for anyone who spent time in Guadeloupe's sun. They used decorative pins to hold the patterns of various headpieces in place. And they all are a little bit different, a little bit unusual. And the women developed many different styles on the island. The headdresses also, like their bracelets, have very colorful names and meanings. and they run to such things. The hat styles might be called the bat. You know, like my wife's an old, no. Uh, I'm going to pay for that one. The firefighter, the liberalist, and even the Guadeloupean woman. Now we're going to look at some of the Christmas holidays that they celebrate here, and I'll talk a little bit about them on each island. Here they use a classic French Yule log that's called the bûche de Noël. It's a favorite Guadeloupean dessert. On Friday nights and the weekend evenings from December 1st to the 24th, they sing Christmas carols, and there's a lot of dancing around the city. Roast pig is the centerpiece of the Christmas meal in Guadeloupe. Midnight Mass is obligatory for the religious people here, and the French tradition of a réveillon, or a late night meal, is the norm for many people. Now, the name of the dinner is based on the word réveil, which basically just means waking, and that's because the participation involves staying awake until midnight and beyond. Well, we kind of do that in the West. Some of us do, or some of you do, I should say. At some point, a sip or two of shrub is obligatory. Now, this is a beverage. This one's probably more on the safe side anyway. It's a homemade concoction. It's prepared from local rum, and that's infused with sweet spices like cinnamon and clove, and it's further kind of perfumed with macerated clementine orange peel. Doesn't that sound good? Macerated clementine orange peel. Probably the closest thing that you're going to find in a normal liqueur or whiskey might be Cointreau. But you'll find that Caribbean shrub carries a bit of an added kick as well as a spicy flavor. They don't use the lowest proof rum that they can find, by the way. French is the official language in Guadeloupe, so I wish you Joyeuse Noël. Now let's sail over to Grenada. A country consists of 3 islands, Grenada, Curacao, and Petite Martinique, which form the southern end of the Windward Islands. A windward island, as you may remember, is one that has very lush vegetation, and of course it gets that because it also gets a lot of rain. Anyway, the capital of Grenada is St. George, and that's where we're going to dock. To the uninitiated, Grenada is better known for its storms because it catches a lot of storms coming in off of the Atlantic, and those storms, though, may also be literal and political. Hurricane Ivan damaged 90% of Grenada's buildings in 2004, and that left more than half of the population homeless. 39 people, unfortunately, lost their lives during that storm. There are still some lingering effects, such as churches that don't have roofs and houses that are still being rebuilt. Then, 3 years later, Hurricane Emily struck, and both of those storms damaged the island's mainstay, the nutmeg tree. To know Grenada is to know its spices. The volcanic island's very rich soil, together with a tropical climate, ensures the success of its spice production. Nutmeg and mace come from the fruit of the aromatic Myristica fragrance tree. It's an evergreen tree with very dark green leaves and little small yellow flowers. The nutmeg trees take somewhere between 7 and 15 years to be mature enough to bear fruit. Fortunately for the people in this island, hardy new varieties of the tree are being developed that will help them survive the next big storm. Nutmeg came to Grenada when a merchant ship on its way to England left a few of the trees behind. And that was the beginning of a local industry that now produces about 40% of the world's nutmeg supply. Nutmeg itself is a fruit that kind of resembles a little apricot, but you don't eat the apricot. The walnut-sized seed on the inside, the little seed pod, is covered with these red-orange strips, and those strips are mace, and the inside, the hard part of the seed, is nutmeg. Nutmeg and mace have very similar qualities. Mace is often preferred, if you will, for light dishes because it has a very bright orange saffron-like color, and mace is more delicate. It's just a nice light taste, and nutmeg itself is a little bit sweeter. Nutmeg is usually grated or ground to flavor many dishes, and it's believed to cure a few things: digestive problems, liver and skin problems, and It's also thought to have aphrodisiac qualities. I always carry a couple of nutmegs in my pocket. Over time, more spice plants were brought to Grenada. Cinnamon comes from the inner bark of the Cinnamonum verum tree. It's grown for 2 years. The tree itself grows for 2 years, and then they coppice it. That means they cut the top off of the tree, and they leave a stump behind. Well, the next year, about a dozen shoots or so will spring up from the roots of the tree, and those shoots are processed by first they cut them off, and then they scrape off the outer bark of that shoot. And then they beat on the shoots to loosen the inner bark that's then peeled off in very long rolls. The whole length of the stalk gets peeled off. And only that thin inner bark is used for the spice. It has to be processed while it's still wet before it starts to dry out, because then it starts to get hard. So they process it right after harvesting. It only takes about 4 to 6 hours for it to dry, and they put that in a well-ventilated, relatively warm environment. Of course, when you're on this island, there's no such thing as a relatively cool environment. Now, who thinks of these things? I mean, how many people have ever thought about, well, I'm going to peel the bark off of that plant so I can chew on the inner bark because it tastes good? Boy, I got to tell you, somebody back in history had to be really hungry. Anyway, also grown in Grenada is the clove. Now, cloves are a dry flower bud. They're not the seeds or anything else. They're a bud from a plant that was originally native to Indonesia, and it was once one of the world's most valuable and expensive commodities. Basically, it was clove that sparked the Dutch colonization in Indonesia. The flower buds themselves are bright red when they're ready to be harvested, and the cloves are used to be, they use them whole, or they use them to grind up to put in things like seasoning hams and sausages, meats, mincemeat, fish, and pickles. And they also, for those of you who might have a toothache, just see the chef and take one, because they have a numbing effect on the tissues of the mouth. Another important crop on the island of Grenada is sugarcane. It's harvested here from January to about May, and the ripe canes are then chopped up or cut up and delivered to a mill to be then further chopped up and pressed to extract the juice. That juice is strained, and then it's placed in a big copper kettle to be boiled down and ultimately clarified. After boiling, that liquid sugar, which is now called molasses, and depending on how long they cook it, depends on what the color will end up, is then placed in some coolers. Ultimately, the molasses is sometimes exported off the island, so it goes to places like Boston or New York or other places for processing, or some of it is piped into a still right next to the press, where it's made into rum. Now we'll take a look at a little bit of Grenada's cultural history. The Caribs settled here before the 14th century. They conquered an earlier population of the Arawaks. I've said that before. On his third voyage to the New World, Columbus discovered Grenada, and he named it Concepcion. While the Spanish never established a colony here, the name Grenada most likely was given to it by Spanish sailors, and it was probably after the city of Grenada in Spain. The English failed in their attempts to settle here, and then a French expedition from Martinique founded a permanent settlement on Grenada, about the mid-1600s. Now, the Carib either left for neighboring islands, which is something they did in several other places, or they may have just retreated to more remote parts of Grenada itself. In any event, the last Carib village on the island disappeared sometime in the 18th century. The French named the new colony La Grenade. Its capital was known as Fort Royal, and it was ordered to be built by Cardinal Richelieu. Fort Royal was later renamed Fort George. Now, Fort George today is one of the best remaining examples of a Vauban-style fortress in the world. And we talked about the military architect Sébastien de Vauban in the last lecture. He was the foremost military engineer of his age, and his star-shaped Vauban forts were designed so that they could defend themselves better against bullets and cannon shot. The old fort figured prominently in a whole bunch of different things: the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Grenadian Revolution, and the U.S. Caribbean intervention in 1983. The barracks building was also a prison. And then later, It became the island's first hotel. It's kind of like, come and visit us and get a cell with a view. I don't know how that would work. Anyway, today many of the buildings at Fort George house the Royal Grenadian Police Force, but some sections are still open to the public, and you can walk around the ramparts to see cannons and kind of get an overview of the fort, and they have spectacular panoramic views from up on the top of that fort. It's a beautiful place to visit. No other French colony had a harbor that was quite like this one, or could even compare with that of St. George. To wait out harsh hurricanes, the French Navy would often shelter in the capital's natural harbor. La Grenade prospered with its main export of sugar, and they established a little bit later on an indigo dye production. The colony was ceded to the United Kingdom in 1763 by the Treaty of Paris. Well, the French didn't like that, so they retook the island during the American Revolution. And during that, it was a very bloody land and naval battle. The Battle of Grenada was fought between the British Royal Navy and the French Navy, and that took place on the 6th of July in 1779. The British fleet was headed by Admiral John Byron. He was the grandfather of the guy we know of as Lord Byron, the writer. Anyway, the British fleet sailed here in an attempt to relieve the British forces on Grenada. The French forces had just captured it. Incorrectly believing that he had numerical superiority, Admiral Byron ordered a general chase of the French. He just figured he'd just run the French fleet down. But during the battle, fire destroyed many of the houses on the city, and because it was a pretty disorganized attack by the British, the French had superiority, and the British fleet was badly mauled in the encounter. Well, we got to kind of turn the clock ahead again, because in 1877, Grenada was made a crown colony of the UK, and it became an independent country in 1974. Within 5 years, the prime minister was ousted in a coup that was organized by the leftist New Jewel movement. I think they got the name from the local harbor thing where they have Tanzanite International and Diamonds International. Anyway, that coup was led by a man named Maurice Bishop. He proceeded to strengthen his ties with Cuba and with the U.S. at the same time. That made him pretty unpopular in some places, and in 1983, Bishop was placed under house arrest by the people who were opposed to him. Since he had support from the local people, he got free relatively shortly. But when he attempted to regain power on the island, he was recaptured, and this time, instead of putting him in house arrest, they executed him in the courtyard at Fort St. George. Then the People's Revolutionary Government ruled by decree, and the Constitution on the island was suspended. They declared a 4-day curfew. Now, during that curfew, anyone who left home without prior authorization, prior approval from the government, would be shot on sight. Now, I have a question when I read this in the history books. If you were kept in your house and you wanted to go out, but you couldn't go out without permission, how did you get permission? Think about that. Anyway, doctors, teachers, technicians, and so on came to the island from Cuba to assist the country's reforms. That coup, the coup that overthrew Bishop, provided a pretext for an invasion by the United States. U.S. forces, along with Caribbean peace forces, landed at Cato Beach on Grenada. The compelling, quote-unquote, rationale for the invasion was to protect American citizens who were attending St. George's University Medical School. President Ronald Reagan said that the Marine landing at Grenada was not an invasion, it was a rescue mission. Grenada was the largest American combat action since Vietnam, at least up to that point in time. There was a 4-man SEAL team that parachuted offshore from the island, but unfortunately they drowned in the heavy seas. The invasion was criticized by Queen Elizabeth II, who had been Grenada's head of state. The United Nations General Assembly condemned it as a flagrant violation of international law. It didn't last very long, and within a few months it was all over, and Grenada began to return to normal. They had free elections that were held the following year, and things have been relatively peaceful. Now, what is there to do and see in Grenada? Well, this one's kind of interesting. It's called Moliniere Bay, and it's about 2 miles north of St. George, and it's an area that's designated as a national marine park. The bay is enclosed by some rocky headlands, and it has a small beach. It's home to over 65 underwater sculptures, including this circle of humans. Basically, this area where these underwater sculptures are covers an area that's maybe a couple of hundred square yards. Now, how did all those sculptures get there? Well, the Grenada people realized that their reefs were suffering from considerable storm damage in recent years, and additionally, there was a lot of degradation that was being caused by overuse from humans. A lot of people would flock to the beaches and go out and they'd walk on the coral and things like that, and so that was creating a real problem. Well, one of their solutions was the placement of these underwater statues that ultimately would provide a basis or an environment for marine growth to live on. Now, even though they haven't been there that long, this picture was relatively early on. Today, when you go there, there's a lot of new coral and other kind of underwater growth that's showing up on them. And so they're already doing what they were expected to do. The English is the official language at Grenada, and so happy holidays and Merry Christmas to you all. Now let's sail over to Curacao. Netherlands Antilles consist of several islands, including Curacao and Bonaire. Now, Curacao and Bonaire, together with Aruba, form the Dutch Leeward or ABC Islands. Everybody goes, what's ABC mean? Aruba, Bonaire, Curacao. Anyway, Curacao is a relatively low island. Actually, it's a really low island, and it's pretty arid. It's very desert-like. The flora of Curacao is very different from that we're going to see on other islands because it's not tropical. It's more desert-like. Now, the name of the island may actually have originated with the Portuguese. They used their word for heart because they were referring to Curacao as a center of trade or the heart of trade. Near the desert scrublands are common all over this island. It's very desert-like, and there's cacti and thorny shrubs, and the national tree, which is the divvy-divvy tree. Divvy-divvy rarely reaches its maximum height. If you grew this tree someplace where there wasn't any wind, it would get to be about 9 meters or some 30 feet high. But here, it rarely ever gets close to that because its growth is very strongly affected by the very strong trade winds. Those winds batter the coastal sites where it grows. They get little pods off of this tree, and out of those pods they get tannins that are extracted from them. So they use these divvy-divvy pods for leather production here on the island, and perhaps even in other places. As with nearly all the Caribbean islands, the original inhabitants of Curacao were Arawak. Their ancestors migrated to the islands from the mainland of South America, which as we're over in Curacao, you're going to realize isn't very far away. And that was a couple of hundred years before the Europeans arrived. The first Europeans recorded seeing the island were Spanish members of an expedition in 1499. When they got here, they enslaved most of the Arawak people. Some of those people were shipped to other colonies because they needed slaves and workers there, and there wasn't that much to do on this island. Conquistadors and other explorers from Europe basically ignored Curacao because, again, it was an island with no gold deposits. In 1634, the Dutch arrived, and they came to the island because they were now free from Spanish rule, and they could travel. They could go out and do their own exploration and do their own thing. The Dutch West India Company founded the capital of Willemstad on the banks of an inlet here on the island. To the Dutch, Willemstad's natural harbor was ideal for trade. It was located in a perfect place, had really good conditions and good wind. Commerce and shipping became Curaçao's most important economic activity at the time. They built forts at key points around Curaçao to protect themselves from foreign powers, privateers, and of course the ever famous or popular pirates. 6 of those forts are quite well preserved, and you can see them today. Fort Amsterdam, which actually, this is part of Fort Amsterdam. It doesn't look like a fort, but it is part of it. It's one of the most important of Curaçao's forts. It's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It was built to guard the entrance of the harbor from enemy ships. Dutch soldiers, as well as some slaves from Angola, worked on it, and they put the whole thing together. But conditions in this fort were so poor, mostly because of the lack of drinking water and food. Well, the soldiers were really starting to rumble like they were going to mutiny, so the government decided, well, maybe we better do something about that. So they gave the soldiers a pay raise and improved their rations. But I don't think they really could provide them with much bottled water or any kind of water. Anyway, when it was completed in 1634, most of the island's population went to live inside the fort. Pretty soon, the city of Willemstad grew outside of the fort. And today, the offices of the cabinet and the governor of Curaçao are located inside. At the rear of the courtyard of the fort itself is the fort church. And that's Curaçao's oldest Protestant church, and it's also a museum. There is a cannonball that was shot by the British during a raid, and that's still embedded in the wall of that church. Jews settled on Curaçao after being driven out of Spain and Portugal by the Spanish Inquisition. Today, it has the oldest active Jewish congregation in the Americas, and it dates back to 1651. The Mikveh Israel Emmanuel Synagogue is the oldest synagogue in the Americas in continuous use. It was constructed back in 1732 on the site of a prior or earlier synagogue. This temple is unique because it has a sand floor. The floor pays homage to those earliest Jewish settlers, the very early Jews who came here escaping from Spain and Portugal, because they had to muffle the sounds of their footsteps as they were trying to escape during their escape, as well as prayers during the Inquisition. The Jewish Historical Cultural Center is inside the temple or inside the synagogue. Different religious objects from the early days on the island are on display here, and they include a Passover table ready for the Seder, spice boxes, candlesticks, and Torah covers. There's a unique custom here is the practice of throwing the wine glass at a wedding at the platter after the wedding ceremony. And that causes a dent or a permanent mark that's left on the platter after the wedding. In 1662, the Dutch West India Company made Curaçao one of the largest slave depots in the Caribbean. The monument shown here was built to commemorate the end of the slave trade, but it wasn't constructed until 1999. Slaves were often brought to Curaçao for sale elsewhere in the Caribbean. The last slave galleon arrived in the harbor in 1788, and at that time the West India Company had transported maybe 500,000 Africans to slavery. The Dutch abolished slavery in 1863, and that brought a major economic change and a shift to wage labor here on the island. The first profitable industry established on Curaçao was salt mining. Salt proved to be a very lucrative export early on, and it was a major factor in developing the island's international commerce. Many Dutch colonists became very wealthy from the slave and the salt trades. Some of the island's inhabitants moved to Cuba and other islands to work on sugarcane plantations after slavery was abolished. Other former slaves had nowhere to go. I mean, they didn't have the money, they didn't have the ability, so they stayed here, and they remained working for their plantation owners in a tenant farmer system, kind of as sharecroppers. And that was where the former slave leased the land from his former master. In exchange, the tenant promised to give up most of his harvest to the plantation owner. That system remained in place until the early 20th century. Willemstad has 4 very distinct historic districts, and those are separated by water and natural harbors. Within the district, there are very complicated alleys and open streets. It's kind of a little bit of a maze to walk around, but it's very interesting. And a lot of the buildings have very striking English architecture. The Curaçao architecture also blends Dutch and Spanish colonial styles. And during the 18th and 19th century, this island government changed hands between the British, the French, and the Dutch several times. It was, again, a squabble that was going over the Caribbean for centuries. Land houses and former plantations are scattered all over the island, and so are the West African-style former slave dwellings. Historic buildings in and around Willemstad have resulted in the whole capital being designated as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. In the early 19th century, Portuguese and Lebanese were attracted to Curacao for business opportunities, and the stable Dutch rule returned in 1815 after the Napoleonic Wars. In 1914, oil was discovered in Curacao. I mean, a lot of people don't think about oil being that far back. Suddenly, the fortunes of this island were dramatically altered. There was a surge in employment here because the opportunities attracted a new wave of immigrants. Royal Dutch Shell and the Dutch government built a large oil refinery on the site of a former slave trade market. There were a number of geographic, economic, and political advantages to establishing a refinery on this island off of the Venezuelan coast. One of the things was they predicted a market growth in the U.S. Because the Americans were now building and buying cars. Also, oil production in Mexico was troubled politically, and the Panama Canal was going to result in an increase in marine traffic. So there were a lot of benefits that they saw coming from this oil. As a result, Shell became the largest employer on the island. Curacao gained self-governance in 1954 and is an island territory within the Netherlands Antilles. In a referendum in 2005, the residents voted for separate status outside of the Antilles. When the dissolution of the Netherlands Antilles occurred 5 years ago, Curacao became a country within the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Today, that kingdom retains responsibility for defense and foreign policy for Curacao. It also oversees the island's finances under a debt relief arrangement that was agreed upon between the islands and Holland. Since then, the island has developed a pretty vibrant economic and tourist industry. Most tourists originate from the eastern United States, South America, and even from the Netherlands. They also offer very low corporate taxes to encourage companies to come here to avoid higher taxes elsewhere. I think we might have heard a little bit about that. Anyway, one of the businesses that came here is the Lynx Corporation. Early in 2016, so if you want to come back or you want to stick around for a while, the Lynx rocket plane is expected to begin flying scientific research missions and suborbital tourism flights from a new spaceport in Curacao. Now, because it doesn't have any propulsion system other than its 4 rocket engines, the Lynx has to be towed out to the end of the runway. And once it sits out there on the end of the runway, the pilot, I don't know if he lights a match or how he does it, but he ignites the 4 rocket engines and they begin to take off, and they do a really steep climb. The engines shut down when it reaches about 138,000 feet or 42 kilometers and a speed of about Mach 2. The space plane will then continue to go up a little further in an unpowered flight until it reaches an apogee that's about 200,000 feet or 61 kilometers. There'll be a little over 4 minutes of weightlessness before you re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. Occupants may experience up to 4 times the force of gravity during re-entry. And the Lynx will come over the top, and then it will glide down to an unpowered landing, back where it started from. Okay, ticket price, $150,000 for a ride in a 1-pilot, 1-passenger rocket. That works out to about $5,000 a minute. I think that's great. The total flight time is estimated to be about 30 minutes, so it's a kind of an exciting thing. Anyway, if you want to go, let me know. But there's other things that I can think of that I would rather do. I think that I'd need a little fortification if Susie talked me into riding a rocket. Curacao liqueur. Most of you are familiar with this beautiful blue liqueur. It was developed here. And actually it happened when a local guy experimented with the rinds of citrus fruit that's known as Laraja. Laraja is a descendant of the Valencia orange, and it was brought here by the Spanish conquistadors. Now, the nutrient-poor soil and arid conditions on Curacao really were pretty unsuitable for Valencia orange cultivation. It resulted in a kind of a small, bitter fruit that's all but inedible. But the Laraja peels are very aromatic, and they're quite flavorful if you like eating orange peel. Anyway, they take those things and they maintain much of the essence, the smell, and the subtle flavors of a Valencia orange. The liqueur was first developed and marketed by one of three very prominent Jewish families here on the island back in the 19th century. The Laraja peel is dried and then it's soaked in a vat with alcohol and water for several days. The peel is removed and other spices are then added. And it has, the stuff starts out, it's naturally colorless. And so being entrepreneurial, they add artificial coloring to give it kind of a uniqueness. Most common colors when you find this are blue or orange, and that's to give it an exotic appearance to cocktails and other mixed drinks. Okay, the color of the Curacao liqueur reminds me of something else here. The shelf of the seafloor called the Blue Edge. This is right off the island. Basically, it's a steep cliff that's only about 100 feet from the shoreline. And that means if you go to the beach, you can pretty easily access some of the best dive sites along any of the island's many beaches. And as a bonus, the water here, just to kind of let you know if you're into swimming and diving and scuba and stuff like that, the water temperature here is almost universally 80 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. It's like being in a bathtub. Anyway, snorkeling and diving are amazing. Visibility here can be about 30 meters or 98 feet. And the massive coral reefs in close proximity to the shore almost completely encircle the whole island, and they're spectacular. The Curacao Underwater Marine Park stretches across about 1,500 acres of reef and over 10,000 acres of inner bays with hundreds of fish species. I mean, literally hundreds of different kinds of fish. And at times you can see sea turtles, and of course, not at times, almost all the time you can see a sunken ship or two. It's also easy to spot manta rays and barracudas and reef sharks. And some of those reefs, though, have been affected by tourists. Again, people inadvertently stepping on and breaking off the coral. Puerto Marie Beach is experimenting with some artificial reefs, and they put out hundreds of blocks of artificial coral material that have been placed where those reefs have been damaged. And those have now become home to large schools of fish. And I think you'll like him. Kind of looks like you want to kiss him, doesn't he? The official language of Curacao is Dutch. So let me wish you Proost. That's a Dutch word for cheers. And the season greeting, which is Vrolijk Kerstfast. And if you would, please join me out in Baristas for a cup of coffee and a little chat. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.